We are at the precipice of a titanic shift in the global economy. Canada has set aggressive targets to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030. The US by 50%. So how do we hit those targets while maintaining prosperity and energy security? Research, innovation, and adoption of renewables have rapidly expanded in the past decades. But even with these advances, renewables alone will not get the world to the net zero commitments made in the Paris Agreement. High carbon industries need to be a part of the transition. Change is a certainty. How will we adapt? Leaders across the economy are asking themselves, how do we protect prosperity and planet? How will we finance this green revolution? Banks must support their clients to grow and thrive in this new economy, while making a good return themselves. Investors want to understand how to use financing instruments, valuations, risk management, and corporate finance practices in this new environment. Innovators are disrupting the energy industry and need support to get to market. Energy companies are looking to fund their shift to low-carbon technologies, using their experience to meet customers' demands. Universities are conducting research in new technologies, approaches, and financial mechanisms. All players from the finance and energy industries need to better understand how sustainable finance impacts access to capital and investor confidence. This is the challenge of a lifetime. To discuss these opportunities, we've assembled a panel of leaders in their field. Dr. Yrjö Koskinen, Aaron Engen, Lorraine Mitchell-Moore, and John Redfern. To moderate today's conversation, please welcome Kristen van de Biesenbos.
I'm going to start by asking a few questions of our panelists. And the first question is really geared towards introducing you to each member of our panel and giving you a sense of how the work that they do is connected to sustainability and transition finance. So I'm going to open it up to the panel, starting with Dr. Yrjö Koskinen, about if you could just explain to us your role and how your work is connected to energy transition and sustainable finance.
Thank you, Kristen. I'd be delighted to do so. So I'm a professor of finance at University of Calgary and Haskell School of Business. And what we do in the university, like Dr. McCauley said, we create knowledge, we disseminate knowledge, and teach students. So we know that energy transition is a tremendous technological and engineering challenge. But we at the Haskell School of Business, we also understand it's a huge business challenge. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be doing research on sustainable finance, teaching sustainable finance, and also disseminating research in finance and business. So this is a challenge of a lifetime, but also an opportunity of a lifetime.
Thank you, Yrjö. And now the same question to John Redfern, CEO and Chairman of Eivor Technologies.
Yeah, we're pronounced ever as an energy forever. Everyone makes the same mistake. But I'm here as a representative or an example of an energy startup that's part of the transition, that's helping to drive and facilitate that transition. For ourselves specifically, we've taken geothermal and revamped it to make it scalable. And that's, we think, is going to make a major difference, because in doing so, we're going to be the only green, renewable, scalable energy source that's also dispatchable at base load. And that's the thing we're missing. When we saw all the windmills and solar panels at the start, kudos for including geothermal. People usually don't, but all of those are, intermittent, and there needs to be a dispatchable form of green energy. That's our role in the transition.
Thank you, John, and apologies for mispronouncing Eivor Technologies.
Ever. Well,
Ever.
Everyone always remembers it the second time. So
I almost made a joke about everyone making that mistake, but I wouldn't make such a bad pun.
That's a good one.
I now have the same question for Lorraine Mitchell-Moore with Suncor and BMO.
Thanks, Kristen. So I'm a director of both BMO and Suncor, as you said. I've got a huge background in the oil and gas world, and over the last few years have played in the innovation space, especially in energy transition. So my role as a director on both BMO and Suncor is the energy transition, and the goal to net zero by 2050 is a huge part of the long-term strategy of both companies. And BMO on the one side is, of course, addressing its own internal targets to get to net zero, but also, as Dan mentioned earlier, this commitment to help its clients improve on its goals to reduce its emissions, and all of us to really work towards getting to net zero. And Suncor, on the board of Suncor, I think this is one of the most progressive companies in oil and gas companies, and has been working for years on reducing emissions intensity and has a goal to reduce that by 2030. And they do that through a number of ways. And really, it's about, as John mentioned, it's about expansion of the energy system, not just oil and gas extraction, but they are doing that through wind investments and cogen and biofuels, and latest project looking at potential CCS and hydrogen. So both companies are playing a big role in the energy transition and getting us to net zero. So my job as a director is to make sure we integrate that into our strategies and we achieve it.
Thank you, Lorraine. And now finally, I have the same question for Aaron Engen, the Vice Chair of Investment and Corporate Banking at BMO Capital Markets.
Thanks very much. My role is very much on the ground. Lorraine admirably described what BMO is trying to do, big picture. I and the colleagues I work with clients to identify opportunities to engage in transitioning their both consumption and production of energy into a low carbon future. And our role is principally one of advising people who are looking to acquire businesses or assets to grow that aspect of their businesses, and including companies like Suncor and Ever as well. We also bring capital to the equation, which is an important element of being able to make this transition. These most of what we're talking about here requires substantial capital investments, and the only way to be able to do that is to find capital providers. And interestingly, there's lots of capital available to do that. It's a global phenomenon, and I'm sure that we'll hear more about that going forward this morning.
Thank you, Aaron. And I do actually also have a question about Canadian companies interested in attracting foreign capital for their innovations in transition and sustainability. But before we get to that question, I do have another question that I want to put to the group. Maybe again, starting with Dr. Koskinen. Yrjö, what do you think are the greatest challenges and opportunities for both Alberta and Canada, whichever you prefer to address, when it comes to the energy transition?
So I think that the greatest challenge is to combine planet and prosperity. It's easy to take care of planet if you run down our economy, but we don't want to do that because I mean that we would end up like the next West Virginia. So we want to maintain prosperity while also getting ready for the radical energy transformation. And in order to do that, I think we have to make sure that we kind of shed away from the traditional Canadian risk aversion and business conservatism. We go for it all in, fortune favors the bold. So I think that's the biggest challenge. The opportunity is that there is so much money available for sustainability and energy transition. And there is huge amount of funds that we just need to tap.
Thank you, Yrjö. I just wanted to say very quickly as well that we already have some audience Q&A questions coming in, which is really fantastic. And once we get through, we have some questions that we want to make sure that all the panelists get a chance to address. And once we've gotten through those questions, we will be opening it up to audience questions. So as these questions come up to you as you're listening to the conversation, please feel free to put those in the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end of our discussion with these prepared remarks, or prepared questions, I should say. So Yrjö, you were talking a little bit about the sense that there is a conservatism in Canada when it comes to investment in emerging technologies. What do you think, John? Do you agree that that's one of the greatest challenges, or what do you see as the biggest challenge to the energy transition here in Canada?
Well, there's a couple of things. I think part of it is just changing our mentality from being a resource owner to being a technology provider. Up to now, we've always talked about what we're extracting from the ground, whether it be oil or gas or some other resource. When it comes to the new renewables, we're not particularly strongly placed for wind or solar or even geothermal. We're relatively cool geologically. But we do have this incredibly competitive service sector, and we do have lots of technologies that can be building blocks for other new technologies, whether it be carbon capture, whether it be hydrogen, whether it be geothermal. These all can be leveraged from our existing skill set. And looking forward in the future, it's not just a question of setting up, as we said earlier, but setting up a green or clean economy. It's how do you set one up where we're a leader, where we're exporting our technology around the world and can still maintain the lifestyle we have at the moment. And we're only going to do that if we change that mentality from extraction to technology. When it comes to access to capital, there is a lot of it sloshing around, but it comes in different tranches. And in an energy startup, you need to progressively access each different tranche. So we started out on the seed capital or angel investment, and there's lots of good angel investors here in Calgary. We ran into Ross McCurdy and Doug Beach. They were great start-offs to us. And after that, so you have to get into sort of VC sort of growth capital. That I have to say we struck out within Canada. We had to go all the way to Singapore to get that. And when it comes to the project capital or implementation capital, we've got a lot of great government programs, SDTC, Alberta Innovates, NRCan, Emissions Reduction Alberta. They all contributed and help us build our demo plan. But they're not set up to fund things going forward. And again, still government institutions like EDC and PDC, they've all played their part with us anyways, helping us get set up and helping potentially finance exports. But when it came to getting the strategic partners, unfortunately, we found we had to go to the BPs and the Chevrons of the world. We have not yet, anyways, been able to get those same sort of strategic partners who can help us scale going forward. And then past that, when you refinance things and turn them into an infrastructure asset, there again, we have a lot of Canadian support, a lot of infrastructure funds in town or in Canada to do it. So for us, our personal experience, it's been that middle tranche, the sort of VC growth funds or the strategic industry partners, where there has been a little bit of that conservatism, there has been a little bit of that reluctance to step forward. And so we've had to go international for it.
Thank you, John. And Lorraine, what do you think? What do you see, especially since because of your role in Suncor, maybe you can give us some insight, challenges in the energy transition and moving to a more sustainable, low carbon economy that particularly affect the oil and gas sector and what that sector can contribute.
Yeah, I think that the greatest challenge, and I think we're starting to finally talk about the greatest challenge, is that this is a very complex system. And even your video at the beginning, the wind and solar, I mean, everybody simplifies it, right? Wind and solar is going to solve everything. But I think we're finally starting to have the real conversation about this complex industrial system that is emissions everywhere. And it's 80% of the emissions. And we need to decarbonize the industrial sector. And we need to do it in 30 years. And that is a huge challenge. And Yuri mentioned the amount of capital that's going to go into that is just massive. So that leads us to, it's a huge opportunity, I think, for Alberta and Canada in general. I think we need to think about it right across the country. So I really think about it like what energy assets we have today and what has that done for our customers and what do our customers globally need in the future and how do we really expand that energy system. So when I think about that, I think we have a fantastic strategic asset that's long life, and with the bringing technology to these long life assets like AI, machine learning, CCUS, making hydrogen, etc. You actually can make expand the whole energy system. And I think that's how we need to think about it. We need to, as John mentioned, we got existing building blocks and then expand that to new products. So it's really reframing the whole energy system. We're not oil and gas extractors anymore. We're going to use all of the hydrocarbons that we have to make new products like hydrogen or store it in the ground with CCS or utilize the CO2 into different products, or make advanced materials like carbon fiber or polymers, etc. I think there's a huge opportunity for Alberta and for Canada in general. You think about that, we have the cleanest electricity system in the world. So it's huge opportunities for green hydrogen. So I think that's the opportunity side. The second side of that, I think what we need to do is create the conditions, and something that Canada, we lead in our policies and tough regulations, but they're not simplified and create the conditions for investment. And so I think we need to bring our patient capital. John mentioned our mid-cycle capital. We are missing scale-up capital. We need to bring our patient capital together with our private sector capital in Canada so we can scale up these technologies. We need to provide the policy support, the regulatory support. This is going to take a massive collaboration, I think, between industry and government and our financial institutes to really bring all this together so that Canada can compete globally. So it's a huge challenge. I think we're finally having the great conversation of what it's going to take. But it's going to take a hell of a lot of collaboration and focus to be able to do it.
Thank you, Lorraine. And Aaron, I think what Lorraine is saying is that Alberta and Canada has a tremendous amount of know-how and a tremendous amount of ability to play a leading role in energy transition and sustainability. But what she's mentioning when it comes to the challenges, a big part of that is financing. In the transition and scale up, the financing is really a big part of that challenge. Since you work on the financing side, what do you see as being some of the biggest challenges and opportunities?
I absolutely agree with everything we've been talking about to this point, and it's quite right that middle segment of the capital structure, the need for capital to develop projects is tough to come by. We talk with a lot of folks on the client side that are looking for capital to grow businesses, and it can be a real challenge. And sometimes you have to go outside of the country to be able to get that. Part of that's a function of the size of our economy, the size of the financing network here, and the ability to go to places where there's bigger pockets, more capital. You can do those sorts of things. As it relates to funding projects, and I'm sure John would have seen this, there's lots of capital out there that once you have contracted assets and you've got good counterparties, you can get abundant cheap debt, you can get good equity. It's that trick shot of getting to that point where you can fund that. There is a lot of interest in providing capital to grow businesses. One of the challenges that we're faced with at the same time as well is that as we drive through this energy transition, making sure that we're picking the right technologies. That's a tough thing to do. As Lorraine talked about, we want to decarbonize the economy. We've got to get all this done in 30 years. Lots to do from policy perspective, lots to do on the regulatory front. But at the same time, we know there's lots of competing technologies. The kinds of things that Ever is doing I think are fabulous. It's that kind of R&D that we need to see in that kind of project and technology development. It's surprising to me that we don't have more of that kind of thing going on. I recall many years ago discovering just by happenstance that we have some real interesting pockets here in Alberta where we have some real leaders. We were involved with a client many years ago that was selling, this is going back to the older technology, but Alberta's a leader or was a leader in downhole technology, downhole tools. And it's just a function of the work that's been done in the province. You begin to realize the advanced technology we have around oil sands in this province, and Lorraine would see that with Suncor. And I look around the province, and indeed in Canada, we've been leaders in telecom in the past. We have some leading financial institutions. The greatest opportunity, and the group has touched on this on a number of occasions, we can be industry and technology leaders in those areas we pick. It's not going to happen in solar. It's not going to happen, as John's talked about. It's not going to happen in solar wind. That's already been developed elsewhere. But it's finding the new technologies, investing in them, and that'll come from government. It'll come from the private sector. It'll come from banks and bond and equity providers alike.
Thank you, Aaron. That's interesting that you're talking about sort of picking which technologies to really invest finance, know-how, time in. And I think that leads us into another question that we should probably answer now before we keep going. Yuri, you're actually, as the recipient of the professorship in sustainable and transition finance, maybe you could explain to us what is the difference between sustainable and transition finance?
So sustainable finance is a kind of catch-all name when you take environmental, social, and governance, so ESG issues into account in your financing and investing decisions. So transition finance is a kind of a very emerging subfield of sustainable finance. Let me give you an example that highlights what is transition finance. So when we talk about green bonds, those are very regulated, third-party verified. You have to make impact reports, and you can only get green bond financing for example, you invest in zero emission technologies like renewables. Of course, that would be a disaster for a resource-rich country like Canada, where we have a large oil and gas sector that wants to decarbonize. So Canada especially is now coming up with a transition finance taxonomy that should be released in the next 2 weeks by the Canadian Standards Association. And transition finance is that if you, let's say, an oil and gas company invest in carbon capture, utilization and storage to decrease CO2 emissions, that would be a good target for transition finance. Or even cogen, which increases energy efficiency, would be a target for transition finance. And the challenge in transition finance is, of course, when Canada comes up with its own taxonomy, so own classifications, that this should also be accepted by foreign investors, because these are capital-intensive projects, and we need capital also, not only from Canada, but the United States, Asia, and Europe.
Yuri, that actually makes me wonder too, is creating our own taxonomy and getting, I don't know if buy-in is the right word, but is this one of the ways that we can help position projects in Canada that would fall under this transition finance as opposed to something like green bonds? Is that a way for us to help attract more foreign investment in these types of projects?
So that is the objective for sure. And I hope so. And then the people who have been working on this transition finance classification and taxonomy for the past 2 years, they are very well aware of this issue. So and they are fairly confident that they have hooked up with international financiers, and they understand the special needs of Canada. So I think this is of utmost importance for this country, that this gets accepted.
Thank you. So my next question then is for John. Keeping this sort of idea that there is a bit of a difference, even though they probably fall under the same blanket as, or under the same umbrella as sort of emerging areas of technology that are intended to move us towards a low carbon future. What role do you see geothermal playing, since it would be potentially a beneficiary of this taxonomy that focuses more on transition financing?
Well, geothermal is really the missing link. It's the thing that you use to take the next step. We haven't really been forced to look at it here in Alberta because we're still in the early stages of getting whatever early wins we can on wind and solar and some of these other new intermittent sources, which on the plus side are the cheapest form of electricity per kilowatt hour that you're ever going to get. And we can't compete with that, nor can other people. But they're intermittent and they take up a lot of space. So as we move forward in places in Europe or places down in California where they're starting to overbuild solar already, and then you look at the fact that if you consider what people want to do with electric vehicles and everything else, we're talking about a doubling or tripling of total electricity supply, and you want to do it all 100% green. Well, there isn't enough space on the planet, let alone enough balancing dispatchable power to take into account all the intermittent power from wind and solar. So past a certain percentage point, to go further and to green the last mile of the grid, you need something like us. And fortunately for us, there is nothing else like us in terms of a totally green, scalable, dispatchable source of power. And there's a lot of other things. We play in the heat market too, which also has to be transitioned. We often forget about that, but over in Europe, that's a huge market we're looking at as well. So we think looking in the future, yes, there's going to be a lot of wind, a lot of solar, there'll be some storage, but we think that it's inevitable there'll be a bunch of geothermal as well. And whether that's 10% or 20%, it's still a colossally huge number. And someone's got to do it. And only sort of the variant of geothermal that we've developed here in Alberta, closed loop, really can do that. The other geothermal, it's just not going to be scalable. And that's why the oil majors and other knowledgeable people haven't invested in anything but closed loop, which is what we're promoting.
And is there anything about Alberta in particular that makes it a good place for geothermal and other emerging technologies that fall into this transition sort of space?
That's an interesting question, because one of the things that made Alberta a good place for it is we're a bad place for it. And what I mean by that is we don't really have very hot geology. So the traditional niche products wouldn't work. So, the necessity is the mother of invention. That got us thinking, how could we improve geothermal? And then very luckily for us, a lot of the technologies in the oil sands and other areas that they pioneered in Alberta was precisely the building blocks we needed to create this new form. And, as well, for the last couple of years, there's been lots of people looking to transition out. So whether it's resources, capital, or most importantly, people themselves, they were all here waiting to provide the solution. But Alberta's lack of good hot geology provided us to ask the question in the first place. So it's always interesting. What makes it a good place for innovation? It's a whole bunch of unforeseen things like that.
Thank you, John. And speaking of innovation, Lorraine, Suncor has been at the forefront of sort of hydrocarbon innovation. What do you think, we have here in Canada our 2030 Agenda National Strategy. Do you think that it's achievable? And if it is or isn't, how does financing make a difference? John is talking about how geothermal is a bridging technology that helps to bridge that gap between, constant demand versus intermittent sources of power like wind and solar. So what do you see as being kind of the challenges that face Canada in meeting our own goals in the 2030 National Strategy?
Well, I think in the industrial side, like oil and gas, 2030 is just such a short time frame. It's 9 years, right? And that's a real challenge. And so I think that you cannot meet these targets without government support. And I just want to go back to the innovation side that John talked about, and I think and Suncor fits into this. Broadly, you cannot meet these kind of targets without CCS. And you talk about the Alberta advantage and the reservoirs that we pull the oil and gas from has an excellent opportunity to put the CO2 back into it. We have huge reservoir opportunity for that. And so this could be a real industry for us in CCS and CCUS. And I think the government, if they want to meet 2030 targets, have to actually work with oil and gas to be able to meet these targets. And it needs a real tight plan because you have to reduce emissions in the industrial sector to meet it. There's no two ways about it. So I think the support on the CCUS and over the longer term to meet these targets, again, it's back to supporting hydrogen. You think about the Alberta advantage, I just mentioned CCS. Talk about hydrogen, blue hydrogen. If we get CCS in support, plus the blue hydrogen with natural gas, it's one of the lowest cost hydrogen in the world. And if hydrogen certainly will probably be the next decade in time for 2050 for sure, a major market in transport, heavy duty transport. And then also for the 2050 target, start to use our resources on advanced materials like carbon fiber. And then methane emissions technologies, we're already seeing that we have the toughest methane emissions regulations in the world. And we're already seeing some great opportunities in Alberta with innovation around that side. So, and then of course, biofuels. Suncor is moving into the biofuels and investments in like Engen and municipal waste, turning that into biofuels. So it goes back to what I said, Alberta has all the ingredients to really take advantage of this expansion in the energy system. And I always think about it as a circular economy. You either store the waste in the ground or you make new products out of it. So it's really about expanding our mindset to what we can really achieve in this energy transition.
Thank you, Lorraine. So Erin, I just want to close out sort of my more prepared questions before we get to our audience Q&A with a question to you. So Yuri took the time to explain to us the difference between sustainable and transition finance, and he talked about the development of this Canadian taxonomy for transition finance. And then John and Lorraine talked to us a bit more about some of these emerging technologies that could be a huge source of innovation and possibly even something that Canada could be a world leader on if we take those steps. So my question to you then is the kinds of technologies that Lorraine and John are talking about, the kind of sort of transition finance, which is this maybe not new category, but a different category that some people in Canada are working on sort of creating this taxonomy for. Do you see these technologies and that idea of transitional financing as being something that investors are becoming more interested in?
Yeah, absolutely. And the interest, and I appreciated to go back to the comments that John made earlier on as well about Canadians needing to break away from thinking about investment in a resource-based economy or extraction economy. And it's absolutely true. And we're starting to see that slowly as people focus away from those industries. And when I say focus away, there's still lots of capital coming to them, lots of interest in supporting those industries, but also a broader perspective that we need to be looking at other industries as well. People are comfortable in investing in industries they're comfortable with and know. And we need to spend more time like that, or more time on that, and attracting capital to do that. We are seeing it. We see it with particular private equity. We see it with pension funds. We see it with infrastructure funds, and even with retail investors. There's growing interest in as well. It's going to take time to be able to develop that capital, but it's there and it's in size. And Yuri's comments earlier about the wealth of capital looking to pursue and invest in both sustainable finance and the subcategory is growing on the transition finance. We're very confident that there's a lot of capital there. We're very confident that it'll be put to work. And that being put to work will be at asset levels, project levels, people coming forward with CCS projects. We have a lot of conversation here around that today. A lot of capital chasing that. I expect to see a lot of interest as well in hydrogen. We've already seen the wave of capital chasing renewables projects and renewables assets. So lots of interest at project levels, but also at corporate levels as well as organizations invest in these kinds of businesses.
Thank you, Erin. I want to thank all of our panelists for going through those prepared questions. I'm going to turn now to audience Q&A questions, and I hope you'll forgive me in advance if I don't get to your question, because we already have 30 questions from the audience and more are coming in as I'm talking. So what I'm trying to do is go through some of these questions and look at questions that are getting towards some of the other more specific questions that have been asked and that I can put towards the panel. So I'm putting these questions towards all of you. And any of you who feel like you have something that you'd like to say about these questions, please feel free to do so. So the first question I have for you is, all of you, does the panel have any opinion on the skills required to transition the workforce to a new economy, and how do we get funding for it? So obviously this is a hot topic in a place like Alberta, where we have a lot of people who have been working in the oil and gas sector, more extractive industries, who might be also interested in transitioning some of those skills into these transition technologies, especially as we start to see them get more funding here in Alberta. So to the panel, do you have any thoughts about that?
My simple answer would be the amount of retraining that's required is zero in our particular case, because it's all the exact same skill sets that we're hiring. In fact, almost everyone we hired, except for one person, has been an oil and gas professional. We got one guy who's got geothermal background, but some transitions require a little bit retaining, a little retooling. In our case, it's a one for one. We need geophysicists, we need geologists, we need petroleum engineers. And it's a very easy transition. Other ones may be somewhat different, but that's our experience anyways. Just need to have the business there. The business is there. We need the oil and gas people.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think in the engineering side, we've got the skills. I think in the thinking about globalizing products and thinking about global markets, I think we need more training in that and how to build these global companies. What I would observe in working with a lot of these startup companies, it's very local thinking. And I mean, we've built an oil and gas industry that was very regional and then very continental, but we've had challenges in building a global industry. And I think when I talk about these products that I'm talking about, like CCS, the hydrogen, advanced materials, it's all about building a global industry. We should think global from day one. And so I think that we need much more business training around that, and business training around startups, scale up globally, right? Not just, I've talked to a lot of people I mentor. Are you going to be a lifestyle company? Or are you really going to make a big impact globally? And I think that, I mean, John is already doing that because you've had to go global and get your money, right? And so on the financing side, I come back to that mid-cycle and scale up. I think we need to build that ecosystem here and then go global with it. But I really want to see the ecosystem built here. We're creating a whole new industry. That's the way I look at it. We had an extraction industry, and now we're going to have an energy systems industry, and it's going to be really broad. And so we need right from day one to frame it in a global sense versus just thinking locally and Alberta. It's got to be national. It's got to be international.
Yeah, you're right, Lorraine. And I, to a certain extent, didn't even think of that because I just always thought internationally anyways. I lived in China for 13 years. And even when we did our startup, within the first 10 employees, we had employees in Asia and in Europe, not just to look for money, but all our early clients were over in Europe and elsewhere anyways. But so that, you're right. On the business side, it probably takes a bigger change than on the technical side. Same technical skill set. But we need more, not just more international, but just more marketing and sales and stuff. It was never a big challenge to sell a barrel of oil before.
If I may add to John's point, that I mean, glad that you brought up marketing, because I'm a finance professor, so I usually think about hard skills. Okay, we need some more finance, maybe business analytics, but we definitely, Canadians have traditionally not been very good at marketing. I'm from Finland. We had the same problem, and then Nokia cured us for all that. But now we understand, oh my God, marketing is important. So if we go up to the value chain, Canadians need to learn how to tell our stories and market our products better. So that's going to be also true in the new low carbon economy.
Right, we need to tell stories. And then one more aside, without monopolizing it, we have unusual business cards in our company, and my co-founder's business card, Paul Cairns, his title is storyteller. So there is that requirement.
And Aaron, do you think that Lorraine's idea of becoming a global leader, but starting this sort of new technology using existing know-how in Alberta, do you think that the fact that we already have that know-how makes this in any way easier to get that investment?
Yeah, I do. We have lots of talent, lots of expertise, lots of technical folks and backgrounds here in the province, and when we've been watching the technology growth here in the province, you build on your past successes. Some of the things that John's doing now, as he mentioned, is built on some of the historical successes we've had in this province around directional, just to pick something, directional drilling, for example. If we didn't have the expertise that we had been developing in this province on directional drilling, and I think, John, safe to say, the technology we built originally was we just trying to avoid holes from bumping into each other and being able to send them in the right direction. So along comes John and his team and says, we have this pool of talent, expertise, and knowledge. How can we lever that into something that will be more advantageous on geothermal? Maybe you can talk about that briefly, John, but how we took that technology and turned it into what you're working with, I think, is just is monumental and a great example of what we should be doing in this province.
Yeah, we always joked that what we're trying to do is the exact opposite of everything we were trying to do before. So we use the same magnetic ranging technology not to avoid the other wells, but to collide them. We use a bunch of other technology not to open up permeability in the rock, but to seal it. And so it's a lot of our guys cut their teeth on SAGD thermal simulations. They're all talking about injecting heat into the earth to soften up the oil, make it flow. We're talking about extracting heat from, so you take all the same equations and reverse them. So it is a sort of unusual the way it worked out so well that way.
And the thing I like about that, John, is it's a great example of taking technology and expertise and just retooling it. We see it even on the financing side, where people have been thinking about project finance, structured lending, accessing equity capital markets, bringing in private equity, pension funds, and the like. All those tools are there. We just have to think about how we do these things differently. And to Lorraine's point as well about funding that gap, we can do it. We just have to change our mindset. We're always retooling people inside of our organization. Our competitors are doing the same thing. You recognize there's a massive challenge, but at the same time, as Euro talks about, it's also a massive opportunity. So you bring the right people in, and you tackle it. You get after it. You take all that skill set you had and you retool. And we need to do that. As Lorraine says, we got 9 years to get to 2030. It's going to take a lot of resources, a lot of thinking.
But it is reframing, what business are you in, right?
Yep.
That's really what we're thinking about. And what tools do you have? And you think about it from a customer point of view. I don't think we've ever had to think so much from a customer point of view as we do today. And when you start thinking about the reservoirs that we have, the tools that we have, the molecules that we have, you say, okay, so how could I take all of that and provide a low carbon products to people and low cost, because it's got to be affordable as well. Mm-hmm. And that's our skill set. When you start reframing what we actually got, you get pretty excited about what we're sitting on. It's an incredible asset that we can build from.
I guess the challenge is changing the business mind. So we need different ways of making money, not like John and everybody here said that not selling raw materials anymore, advanced manufacturing, services. So different business models that we used to have before.
Yeah, and the asset that we've built over the last 40 years in the oil sands in particular is a manufacturing assets, multi-decades, long life. That is a strategic asset that we can use all of these tools to really do what we've been talking about for years, which is value added, but globalize.
Let me ask you all, earlier, John mentioned the different incentives nationally and here in Alberta that help to support certain technologies, in his case, geothermal, but other sort of transition technologies. One of the questions that's in the chat that I think is a really good one is there enough regulatory support? Are the regulations in Alberta and also Canada sufficient to really provide the kind of incentives and legal supports that are needed to advance these new transition technologies?
I think there's a lot of work that's being done on that front. I was just actually on a call this morning where we had a lot of discussion on the regulatory environment. The couple of the key things I think we need to have in place is a smooth, predictable, understandable regulatory environment that will facilitate the development of these kinds of technologies, and not just the technology, but the development of the projects, the actual stuff that does the work on the one hand. And that that regulatory environment needs to be set up in such a way that we don't need abundant amounts of capital spent before you get in front of the regulator and can make your applications. We need to have, when I say streamlined, I'm going to say streamlined as well. That isn't to say we cut corners. We need to do environmental assessments. We need to consider all the stakeholder impact that these projects have. But the regulatory environment needs to be able to accommodate that on an expeditious way. Again, Lorraine said 9 years. If we're taking 2 and 3 and 4 years to approve projects, we're never going to get to where we need to be at the end of the day. So that's one really important thing. And the second thing is, from a public policy perspective, we can't have whipsaw going on between what's the accepted norm today, and then a new government comes along and says, I don't like that, so I'm going to redo that in its entirety. It's very difficult for someone to say, I want to spend hundreds of millions of dollars building CCS projects, hydrogen projects, spending a lot of capital building renewables assets or retooling their business, with the worry that with a new government or with a new policy change, that could all be for naught and you've got stranded capital. We need to have certainty on both of those fronts.
Aaron, that's an excellent point. And that's what Canada is really lacking, that the national consensus where we're going. So there should be, I don't know, maybe this is wishful thinking, but some kind of a grand bargain where our political parties would say that this is acceptable to everybody and this is the direction that we're going to be going. Or maybe that is wishful thinking. I don't know. But that would be very good for reducing investment uncertainty.
Yeah, I would start with doubling down on the things we've been talking about today. You know, any business starts with what are you good at and what does the market want? And so to me is really doubling down on these technologies and then really looking at the regulatory. You can't modernize the regulatory system, you know, take on the world, right? And boil the ocean. And so when I think about the regulatory system, our regulatory system is so prescriptive, it has to be outcomes based. And then when I think about, you know, CCS, I was part of Shell when we did the Quest project and CCS. And the biggest amount of effort we put in was through the regulatory system. And if you start going through the mainstream regulatory system, you are lost for years, right? And so the idea of, first of all, where is the best practice globally and how they do CCS? Let's copy others if they have best practices. And secondly, is take it out from the mainstream and say, we're going to design a regulatory system around CCS. We're going to design around hydrogen if you have to, et cetera. These are the places we're going to be great at. Here's the regulatory, you know, sandboxes, if you like, separate it out and say, this is how we'll do it and make it the best practice globally. And consistency in public policy is absolutely essential. This, like anything investment in industrial side, is a long term. So you've got to be, you know, transcend all political parties. So it has to be a double down commitment for the next 30 years. That's why I go back to the net zero plan. It has to have a plan that is consistent for the next 30 years, or we're not going to be able to do it.
Yeah, it's not just streamlined regulations, as was mentioned. It's got to be speed of execution is important. But for ourselves in Alberta, for example, it's not just the regulations, it's what is the market and how is the market regulated and does it reward what we're offering? Or is it stuck in an anarchistic sort of mode where it's putting out wrong signals? So for us, when we went and started, we went around the world and said, okay, who already has geothermal regulations? We're only going to start with that, because otherwise we're losing a couple of years right up to start. And our favorite country at the moment is Germany, not because of the regulations, but because on the market side, we know exactly what power purchase agreement we're going to get just based on the year we finish it. I know in the year 2025, I'll be eligible if I start a project then for a certain 20-year guaranteed price by the German government. So you got no counterparty risks, no uncertainty. You can plan ahead and execute your project. And as you say, stability in those regulations is important, and markets.
All right, thank you, John. I want to thank everybody again who is attending the talk right now. That is it for the questions. I know we didn't get very far, but in a conversation like this, we easily could have spent 3 times as much time trying to get through maybe 2 or 3 more of your questions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and move it back over to Terry for our closing remarks.
So I just want to say thank you to you, Kristen and Lorraine and Aaron and John and Urya for that, just all of that. I am a longtime environmental studies teacher. I'm a biologist, and what really struck me was some of the comments about the complexity and the kind of recognizing the overall complexity. I thought I knew something about energy as an environmental studies teacher, but this is very educational for me and inspiring as we think about the training that we can do and the support for the talent that's there. And as a new resident of Alberta as well, I was really struck by the idea of acting to take on a leadership role in a new industry, the development of a whole new industry, and the idea and the concept of the talent that's already here, which is really fantastic. So I just want to say thank you again to the BMO Financial Group for the generous gift and in support of sustainable and transition finance research. And I hope we all agree, investing in this critical area at the University of Calgary here in Canada's energy capital, as we heard a lot about today, will have a significant impact as Alberta and Canada continue to innovate and advance us towards a low carbon economy. So this concludes today's event. Thank you all very much for joining us. We look forward to continuing the conversation on energy transition at future events like this one. So hopefully see you again very soon.